Welcome to EPG Pathshala for Japanese. I am Anita Khanna and I teach Japanese in Jawaharlal Nehru University in the Department of Japanese Studies. Today the title of this module is Japanese Aesthetics, and the key terms aware, or also called mono no aware, which means pathos of things. Karuna, the Hindi word, which is equivalent to Japanese avare, or the verb avaremu. Wabi, which means elegant sobriety, and sabi, which means sabishisa, that is sabishi, which is missing something or nostalgic, but also which means something rustic, and also it can mean tranquility. Next word is yugen, which is a mysterious beauty, elegance. Kigo. Kigo is a combination of kisetsu and kotoba. In other words, seasonal words. Makura kotoba, the pillow words. We move on to the main content. The Japanese aesthetics, in other words, what is beautiful? The expression of beauty in any culture may vary from one art form to another and from culture to culture. As it is said, I quote, "The beauty lies in the eyes of beholder." A Japanese artist search for beauty in monochrome paintings, garden landscape using sand and pebbles. In other words, in simple and artless objects is unique. Another glaring example of Japanese aesthetics is the mono no aware, the pathos of things. The Japanese sense of beauty must have been influenced by the parameters of Chinese traditions, especially in literature, due to the dependence on Chinese script, that is Kanbun. In the ancient Japan, the Japanese must have developed their aesthetics or what is beautiful, but one can surmise that when the Chinese model prevailed in all spheres and regarded as the benchmark for the superlative, be it arts or architecture, in all spheres, this influence could also be corroborated due to the fact that among the bureaucracy, court officials in Japan, the scholarship in Chinese literature, especially Chinese poetry, and their ability to compose poetry was a decisive factor for entry into a successful career. The introduction and dissemination of Buddhism in Japan and their interest in the vast corpus of Chinese translations of the Buddhist scriptures must have added another dimension of grandeur to it. Although the poetry collections like Manyosho represent the evolution of poetic techniques from the primitive narrative poetry that represented the sentiments of a community rather than individual poet, onto the refined forms by developing techniques like Makura Kotoba. Yet in the absence of any preface or suffix, it's very difficult to written, one can feel the beauty in those poems, but it is difficult to comment on it in the absence of any written text or comments by the compiler. In the beginning of 10th century, when Japanese traditions experienced the blooming of its native traditions of being a culture which no longer was dependent on Chinese script, one finds the mention of Japanese concept of poetic beauty in the famous preface of Kokin Wakasho, which was scribed by the poet Kinotsurayuki, who was a scholar of Chinese literature and poetics of his times. This anthology, like most of the other prose collections which were previously compiled in his collection, compiled in 905, Kokin Wakasho, or a collection of ancient and modern Japanese poetry, compiled in 905, the compiler Kinotsurayuki wrote a preface in vernacular kana script. He declares clearly that it is waka and not the Chinese poetry or what had come down as kanshi, which falls under the scope of Japanese poetry. In waka, although the prevalent of Chinese poetry or kanshi is obvious in the form of numerous allusions, but as poetry, waka had been regarded since its inception as the most important art form and gained popularity since there were increasing number of opportunities among the aristocrats to compose poetry and show their skill in the poetry parties called uta awase. So for this reason, the nature and seasons and how it is perceived must have occupied the poets of Heian period. What is the origin of Japanese poetry? It is said that this poetic compositions was first sung since the time immemorial when the heavens and earth were created, and the first man Izanagi and the first lady Izanami tied the nuptial bond under the floating bridge of heaven. Later on, this song was handed over to the subsequent generation through the words of Princess Shita Teru. As I said, the term mono no aware predominates the Japanese poetics and the sense of beauty. What is the sense of beauty, especially in literary works? What is the meaning of mono no aware, which is regarded as the key word of Japanese literature? Here the dictionary meaning of aware refers to the verb awaremu in Japanese, which means something pathetic, sympathetic, etc. Needless to say, the feeling of awness of things is attached to mono no aware. It arouses this awness of things when seen in the context of Indian rasa theory or Indian aesthetics. It is close to the feeling of karuna, the emotion eulogized as one of the virtues of Bodhisattva. Motori Norinaga, who lived in the period between 1730 to 1801, which is during the Edo period, was a scholar of national learning, Kokugaku in Japanese. He praised the famous work, Japanese classic and the first novel of the world, Genji Monogatari, as an expression of mono no aware, and this mono no aware he terms as sensibility to things. Subsequently, in the post-Heian period, this concept was replaced by the Mujokan, or the impermanence of things in Kamakura period, and it was further qualified by the concepts of wabi and sabi. The famous preface of Koken Waka, scribed by Kinotsurayuki in Kana script, is the foremost document on Japanese poetics, or defines the poetic beauty. According to him, the seeds of poetry lie in the human heart that grows into the leaves of innumerous words. The men in this world deal with numerous matters in everyday life. Those happenings that people see or hear, especially experiences that move their sentiments, surface in the form of words. The song of bush warbler in spring and the sound of frog in the water, does it not sound like the song of nature by the creatures living on earth? The power of poetry, he says, is such that it can move the heaven and earth without any force. Furthermore, it can touch the hearts of divine as well as devils, and is able to arouse the sense of compassion in both of them, especially the devils. It smoothens the bonds between men and women and soothes the fierce minds of the warriors. Unquote. Here evidently the poetry is treated as something divine that stirs up the core of human sensitivity and nurtures the emotions of compassion, love, calmness. The poet Kinotsurayuki traced the origin of poetry to the creation myths, as he mentioned the names of Izanagi and Izanami, who descend down to create Japanese land. Furthermore, as the subject of fine poetry, Kinotsurayuki points towards the end of his essay, which he wrote in the preface of Koken Waka, poems on wearing garlands of plum blossoms, poems on hearing the nightingale, on breaking of branches of autumn leaves, on seeing the snow, wishing one's lord the lifespan of the crane and tortoise, on congratulating someone, and also on yearning for one's wife when one sees the autumn bush clover or the grasses of summer. Poet Kinotsurayuki concludes, time may change, joy and sorrow come and go, but the words of these poems are eternal. Those who know poetry and those who understand the heart of things, as they look up to and admire the moon in the broad sky. Before Kinotsurayuki, the comments about Japanese poetry are there in the preface of Kai Fuso, a collection of poems by Japanese poets written in Chinese script. The compiler is anonymous, and he points out that At times, the emperor summoned the men of letters. Often, great banquets were held, and on these occasions, the imperial brush let fall prose. The courtiers offered their prose in eulogies, in verse, in poetry. When I recall now those sports with the moon and poetry, and go over the titles of the poems, my thoughts are carried far away and the tears flow without my realizing it. The second key factor that shaped up the Japanese sensitivity to a large extent were the Buddhist concept, and these are the qualities of wisdom, compassion, dana, donations and offerings, and sacrifice. The key concept of Japanese aesthetics, which is mono no aware, stems from the sense of compassion, or it denotes something which is, according to Earl Manner, the term suggests an anguish that takes on beauty or sensitivity to the finest, the saddest beauties. Both the condition and the appreciative sensibility are implied. Something that which stirs cultivated sympathies by touching them with beauty, sadness, and the awareness of ephemeral experience. If we examine the origin, the verb is awaremu, meaning pity or have mercy upon, sympathize, compassion, etc. It is accounted that aware emotion was evoked upon hearing the sad sound of birds and beasts. It was associated with the gentle sorrow, with sensibility of beauty and awareness of its perishability. Like an Indian poet's perception of each season will be different from the Japanese poets. Certain emotions, as we may call in Hindi bhav, are associated with a certain season, like spring with joy, rainy season with love and longing. In Indian tradition, this concept of bhav is classified in 9 categories, which, and the mono no aware can be compared to the sentiment of karuna or the karun ras, which is further refined or softened in Buddhism as karuna. In Japanese aesthetics, the inherent characteristic of human emotions are almost parallel or universal, but in the court poetry of Heian period, it was essential that the emotion was expressed in such a way to create a colorful atmosphere, as emphasized by Kino Tsurayuki.